Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing. This space is rooted in the Caribbean and Global South traditions of reasoning and in the belief that healing, justice, and knowledge must be understood together. In this episode, I am in conversation with Esther Armah. We enter the necessary and demanding terrain of emotional justice. Esther's framework for addressing the emotional legacies of white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, and anti-Blackness. Together, we reflect on the cost of emotional neglect within liberation movements and on the damage done when political struggle is severed from feeling, care, and accountability. Esther challenges us to take the emotional body seriously as a site of history, harm, and repair, and to develop new languages that can hold grief, responsibility, and global Black love. This conversation asks what justice requires beyond policy and protests. It invites us to consider how storytelling, ritual, and media can become tools and what an emotional justice framework demands of us, not only as individuals, but as communities committed to transformation. What a pleasure to have Esther Armah on Saltwater Reasonings. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm so excited. Saltwater Reasonings. I love this title so much. I feel like it's not a word. I feel like it's a flavor. I feel like you can kind of taste it. It's like saltwater reasonings rhymes with seasonings. So I feel like there's like a pepper in there. There's maybe some lime or some mint. You know what I mean? Some garlic, some ginger. It's really evocative.
I love it. Thank you so much. And what a great way for us to ground this conversation about the Dark Atlantic. Yeah, I met you at the Anti-Racism Global Summit in Cape Town, and it was such a beautiful experience. I want to just invite you to share with our viewers your personal and professional journey across continents and across Black communities and across Black womanhood.
So I self-describe as a global Black chick. And what I mean by that is that I claim 3 cities in 3 different countries on 3 different continents as home. So I was born in London, and that's the city of my birth. It's where I went to school. So I'm shaped both by the Black experience of Britain, which is very rooted in the Caribbean, very much Jamaica and Trinidad, but also West Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria. And then there are additional Black and brown communities, the Asian community, the Indian community, and the Irish community as well, but also the colonialism of Britain and its relationship to Blackness. I'm very much shaped by that. It's where I went to school. Then I moved and I lived in New York for almost 10 years. And New York really became, I call it my creative home. It's really a city of my creativity. And it was a place where I bloomed in the work that I do today, which is around emotional justice, which we'll get into. I'm a former journalist. And so the nature of my journalism also made me a traveler. So I was born in London, lived in New York for almost 10 years, and then I moved home to Accra, which is where I'm talking to you now. And my family is Ghanaian. I'm Ghanaian. So Accra is, I call my spiritual and emotional home. It's my heartbeat. And for the work that I do, I always root it in that because global Blackness is the lens through which I move through the world, through which my womanhood is shaped. It really informs all the different ways that I approach what I do and the way that I move through the world. I'm always looking for points of connection and community across cities. And so that even in the tensions, there's often a space or a pause where you can find connection. So I find that that's how I move through different spaces. And then as a journalist, although I was based in London, I did a lot of travel. I was in Washington, in the continent, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. And so being in those spaces and the kind of journalist that I was really shaped how I moved through space. But it's also because I was a woman who was a child shaped by silence. And being shaped by silence makes me a particular type of listener. I can sit in someone else's stillness for a long period of time and not feel moved to fill up space. And so that made me a very particular kind of journalist. And it really serves the work that I do today, which is around emotionality and the way that emotions take up space, even if they're not being spoken.
So let's get into it. I think that is a beautiful frame because you are a griot and I've heard you present. And
No one's ever called me that before.
oh, but you are. You tell stories and you tell stories that are usually silent. And it's almost as though you lift the silence and you speak about what's beneath it. And I was in awe when I heard you speak. You know, I need to name it to tame it. And when it comes to emotions, as Black and Brown people, there's so many things that many of us don't name. So, as a griot who has come up with a framework of emotional justice, I feel as though when I heard you speak, you were talking a lot about the cost of emotional invisibility and the cost for us as humans, as gendered beings, the cost in terms of intellectual extraction, the way that things are taken from us, and how that leads to burnout. And it was said so clearly and succinctly. So you agree, ma'am.
I'm claiming it. Dr.
So
Tracy said it, everybody. Dr. Tracy said it.
I wanna invite you to just speak about how this emotional justice framework came about and to tell us about the components of it. Let's reason around that.
Emotional justice is really, it's born from a broken silence. I was in Accra in covering 40 years of independence, and my dad, God rest his beautiful soul, was telling a story that he told many, many times about the coup of 1966, Ghana's first coup ended Kwame Nkrumah's presidency. Kwame Nkrumah, the first post-liberation, first president of an independent African nation, father of Pan-Africanism, known across the global Black world, the world, in fact. And my dad was an activist who ended up serving in Kwame Nkrumah's government. So I was at home as a journalist covering the story. I was young and fresh and fly, and it was like, I'm going to do the story by day, and I'm going to go find a club and get some heels and wine at night. He was telling the story of the coup. He told it many times, kind of, not really listening. I'd heard it a million times. I knew about it as a point of policy and history and statistics. The date, February 1966, the end of a presidency, transformation of a nation. Until my mother came out holding a tray with some room temperature water and said, well, how would you know what happened? You were not even there. And I was like, wait, what? And it was the first time that I had ever heard, one, my mother speak about the coup, but also that she was actually there the night the tanks came. So in February 1966, tanks rolled up to the homes of people who were ministers and their families as essentially the military took over the government. Military coups are bloody, brutal things. And so the bloodiness and the brutality had never really been spoken about as much as the loss of a leader and the story of a man who had essentially been dethroned in terms of his presidency. But that day, I got a different story. And that was a story of a Black woman, a mother, in her home with her children, who was actually the one in the house when the tanks came up to the front door. She met the soldiers when they came in with guns and rifle butts and broke down the door, broke every piece of glass, dragged drawers out, screamed, shouted, terrorized my sisters who were there with her. She was the one that they put a gun to her head. And she, along with Madame Fataya is our first lady, our former first lady, who was the widow of Kwame Nkrumah, the mother of Paul Boateng. Paul Boateng is Britain's first Black cabinet minister, and his mother was a labor organizer. She is white. His father was a minister in Kwame Nkrumah's government. His mother was at home. So these women with their children were at home the night the tanks came. But history's story of the coup is about a president, a leader, and a date. And so what that got me to think about is, what are the stories that are erased, and how do those erasures shape our relationship with what we define as our nation? How does that shape what we think about as history? But also, how would we be changed as a nation if we knew those stories? How would we think about the coup if we heard women speak about the night the tanks came, and that they were the ones in night dresses facing off tanks and soldiers, one mother after another mother after another? And then when it was 3 o'clock in the morning. So it's mothers with their babies being dragged out of bed. And so that broken silence was critical for me. And it was critical for me. I have no memory of anything that I've shared. This is my mother's story. But what I had were night terrors. I had night terrors for almost 20 years. And I would wake up 3 o'clock in the morning and I would hear all this rumbling. And so it was a nightmare. And I would hear this rumbling. I could hear boots stomping. I could hear screaming in a language that I didn't understand because it was Twi. And my body held the memory of a night that I have no conscious memory of. So when my mother broke her silence, it created a specific connection to the night terrors that I had. Why does that story matter, and how does it shape emotional justice? I was a very young journalist. I'm educated. I have communication skills. I'm eloquent. I felt deeply damaged inside, and I felt like I was always teetering. I was not on stable grounds. I worked hard to control my exterior. So the untreated trauma of that night had shaped my relationship to masking, that I would have to hold myself together in order to look like I was normal, because inside I didn't feel that way. And what that really taught me was that you cannot educate your way out of untreated trauma. You cannot school your way out of untreated trauma. You cannot PhD your way out of untreated trauma. No matter how much education you have, your emotional relationship to your lived experience and the histories that shape you are an entire distinct thing. So that really was the beginning of me focusing on the power of the emotional to shape us, but also understanding that I had a certain amount of emotional illiteracy. And that, from Ghana, I would then travel to Philadelphia to cover the Million Woman March and met Winnie Mandela. I shared with Winnie Mandela the story of my mother. I was getting ready to go to South Africa to cover the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I shared with Winnie Mandela the story that my mother told me. And Winnie Mandela had said, when I go to South Africa, I had all these interviews planned, and it was Desmond Tutu and this one and that one and this one. And she said to me, I want you to go and listen to the women before you talk to the men. I don't want you to, and she said, listen to me. I didn't say I want you to talk to the women. I want you to go listen to the women. And then I want you to go talk to the men. And it's really been the guiding philosophy for me of journalism and the guiding philosophy for emotional justice. Because in doing that, the narrative when I arrived in South Africa, in Cape Town, was it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The entire world's media is there. There's this huge celebration essentially of Black forgiveness of white supremacist violence. It's really what it was. And this whole celebration of how forgiving Black people were, et cetera, et cetera. But listening, and the other narrative was that this was a community that wanted to forgive. They just wanted to know who they were going to forgive. But when you listen to the women, only if you spell forgiveness, rage. Because when I listened to the women, I had a rage. It was not about forgiveness. It was only about justice. It was absolutely about vengeance. It was absolutely about turmoil and still feeling terrorized and having deep levels of resentment that a government would suggest that a nation could forgive when mothers were still navigating the fact that their children were buried under the ground and they were still there. And so I remember when I interviewed Desmond Tutu, with the words of Winnie Mandela in my ear and my mother's broken silence, I realized that I was being shaped by these global Black women to think about the untold, the silenced, and the suppressed, when we're talking about a justice experience. And because this particular justice experience was deeply emotional, the widow of Steve Biko, of course, is the South Africa's father of Black consciousness. She was the one who really gave, for me, her, my experience with her, my interview with her helped me name emotional justice as a framework that needed to be as much a part of any justice movement as social justice, civil justice, gender justice, reproductive justice, labor justice, environmental justice. It was equally pivotal. And it was because the men who murdered her husband were seeking amnesty, 10 white police officers. And they were telling this story of what happened. And they literally were saying there was a bit of a scuffle. Steve Biko went berserk. There was a scuffle. He bumped his head. We tried to give him medical care. It didn't work. He was put in the back of a van. We tried to help him. He died. So then all the world's media and this kind of glare of the lights and the cameras as on Biko, and they're saying to her, now you've heard what these 10 white men have said. Do you forgive them? We are in the throes of this experience and all of these cameras from all over the world. Do you forgive them? And Kosanati Biko is a petite woman. I don't think she's any taller than 5'4". She has salt and pepper gray hair, and she had cane rows all going back. And she was with her son, her eldest son. And sorry, she's in Chico Biko. Her son is in Kosanati. She's in Chiki Biko. Make sure I get her name right and honor that. And she said, no, I do not forgive them. Not only do I not forgive them, I am suing the government because nobody asked my permission before they were going to go and forgive people who are murderers. And no, not only do I not forgive them, not only am I suing you, I want to know how many other families are interested in suing you as well, because this process needs to be about justice. And for me, what I heard her say was the fact that this was a deeply emotional process did not ever mean that you could take the justice element out of it. And why? Because this was about an emotionality that was racialized. And then they universalized the terrorism as if there were two equal victims of the terror that apartheid created. And actually, they didn't even do that. They created an emotional apartheid where they centered the feelings, the concerns, and the anxiety of white people and said to Black folks, do this emotional labor, this outpouring, this trauma telling. White people will feel better about a country that they don't want to change. They want to continue to benefit from the harm that was legislated on their behalf. And then we'll all just get along. And so those three experiences, South Africa, Philadelphia, Ghana, and those women, my mother, Winnie Mandela, and Chiki Biko, really helped me frame the critical element of emotionality as a justice project, that we needed to not just frame it, but to give it specific language in the context of harm and then in the context of healing. That we needed to also disregard this idea that we can simply hold hands and the commitment to be better would enable that to happen in a contemporary world of racialized harm. So that series of combination led me to create the phrase emotional justice. And then it was about the specificity and the particularity of when I say emotional justice, what do I mean? What am I talking about us unlearning as global Black people? What am I talking about in terms of the work that white people need to do? Why am I explaining and requiring that the work be both distinct and articulated as distinct? All of that was part of the work and the conversation. And out of it, emotional justice became this framework that was identifying a legacy of untreated trauma. Is about two things: unlearning the language of whiteness and replacing it with an emotional justice love language. Yes, I wanted to honor and recognize the word love in this work because of how much in emotional justice it really was about the reassigning of humanity to a people who had been stripped of it.
Just want to sit and be with those words and that framing. As you started talking, I went to different places. I thought about our history in the region, in the Caribbean region, and all the things that we don't name or talk about. The expectation that we should recover and move on. I thought about the Grenadian Revolution. I thought about all the stories that I have not heard
And from whom?
And from whom? Talk about who writes the stories. I thought about the fact that I've spent a lot of time in South Africa. I know of Biko. I've not heard this story of his wife. And so I thought about how we decide whose stories are important. I
So
thought
critical.
about the emotional, yeah, the
So,
emotional woman.
right? The emotional labor of women. And because we've gendered emotional labor, the gendering of it leads to this dismissal, this negation, this kind of overlooking. And
Yeah.
so I'm really intrigued when you talk about the Grenadian Revolution, all of these untold stories that shape our histories, that shape the contemporary world, and that they are part of what I call this emotional inheritance. The fact that
Yes.
we don't know the stories doesn't mean that we don't inherit what they leave, what drips from them. It doesn't mean that we're not moved, even in ways that we don't understand, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this racialized emotional labor, this particular emotional labor required by Black people, and then centrally by Black women. I thought it was really important in emotional justice to give it language. And so we called it emotional currency. The idea that the emotions of Black women, it's actually like an economy. It only has value as long as it's in service to somebody outside of ourselves. And the pain of that is it's
Say
true
that
within our own
again.
communities, right? Though?
I want to slow down and just be with that. Like that resonates throughout my entire body. It's true.
Hmm. Steep, steep.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about love language and the love language of Black women, Black men, white women, white men. And this struck me because when I was hearing you speaking, I was thinking about the role of emotionality in decoloniality.
It's such a critical question because I don't know that we've fully understood the role of emotionality in perpetuating oppression and sustaining it and upholding it, and therefore the role in the contributing role of emotionality in the dismantling of oppression, particularly for our liberation movements.
Mm.
And so our movements are driven so often by philosophy, ideology, theory, all of which are critical, but they often implode because of our emotional relationship to our Blackness. Not because we don't believe in the thing that we're trying to do. Which Black person says, I don't want to be liberated. I don't want to be treated like a full human being. I don't want to be able to move through the world and not be harassed or terrorized or disrespected because of the skin that I sit in. Who says that? No, none of us do. And yet, so many movements implode. And so we think that the implosion is connected to, we make all kinds of judgments about who people are. But in emotional justice, I say we have two relationships as global Black people, an emotional relationship to our Blackness, an emotional relationship to power. And both of those things show up and shape our decolonial movements, our liberation movements. And they're such key elements to how oppression was sustained. And so we have not an emotional literacy, but our emotionality was bastardized in order to survive horror. And it's not like it was turned right side up when we got to liberation. So this, what I call manufactured contentment, the idea that Black people were happy to be enslaved and that that was a survival tool, it actually helped. It meant that you were like less likely to be terrorized by the love language of white supremacy, which is brutality. And so if manufactured contentment helped you stay alive, the fact that enslavement is over hasn't necessarily changed your emotional relationship to how you move through space. It hasn't changed your emotional relationship to a whiteness that's always threat. That just because the law has changed, their emotional relationship to power hasn't changed either. And white people's emotional relationship to power is about dominion, subjugation, extraction, and exploitation. It does not understand itself as having value outside of dominion over a body, a land, a thing. And so if that's your relationship to power, when we perpetuate harm, what work has whiteness done to transform that relationship and liberation that makes you safe to anybody, including each other? No work has been done. The work hasn't been done. And yet, the folks who set the terms for levels of harm that are literally unimaginable, like you legislated your deviance, you articulated as there was a specificity to the kind of harm that you wanted to perpetrate. You legislated your pedophilia. You made it legal to marry a 12-year-old. You legislated all of those things. So what was interesting to me is the clarity of language in articulating harm and the vagueness and the evasiveness of language when it came to accountability. So what that tells me is that there is a protection of your harm, and not just an avoidance of your accountability, but the absolute intention that nothing for you will change. And honestly, for me, Tracy, it comes down to, we call it the leader versus learner binary. That the language of whiteness taught all of us, black, white, brown, indigenous, it taught all of us this leader versus learner binary, that leaders look a particular way. And they are the solvers, the saviors, the civilizers, the managers, and the conquerors. And everybody else is to be saved, to be civilized, to be managed, to learn, and to change. All of us bought that. Now, in contemporary world, black folks bought it because people are trying to survive horror, harm, enslavement, colonization, apartheid, all of those things. Having survived it, though, your emotional relationship to labor and to that binary hasn't changed just because the circumstances changed. And so that's why I think the emotional piece has this, what I call this lingering power, because it was such a critical part to sustaining harm, and so therefore should hold a much more critical role to making healing happen. But actually, what happened was white folk really celebrated black folk who kind of overlooked the detail. And I think, when it, particularly when it comes to black men in South Africa, just to bring it back to the globality, part of that was a reclaiming of their masculinity. Because in order for black men to be men, black men had to be men in the eyes of white men, not in the eyes of black women, not in the eyes of their children. In order for them to be men, to feel like men, they had to be men in the eyes of white men. And so what does that mean? Who are you pleasing? Who are you trying to cater to? Who are you trying to engage? And apartheid politically may be over, but the relationship to the kind of harm perpetuated by whiteness, that hasn't changed. That didn't change. Yeah. So when you hear Desmond Tutu say Winnie Mandela has to apologize for a system she did not create and was not responsible for, but William de Klerk can get a Nobel Peace Prize and he's actual president of an actual entire structure that perpetrated harm. Part of what Desmond Tutu is doing, it's a reclaiming of this traumatized masculinity whose only way of survival was to navigate a certain kind of dominion in the face of whiteness. It's a whole thing. It's a whole story. And it makes me wonder how that showed up in the Caribbean, actually.
Yeah, so you're talking about how Black men are taught to define their masculinity, and it's the audience that they're performing for, and it's not Black women. And I think that a lot of that is what has not been named and said. There's a way in which in the Caribbean, because we don't live in a majority white states, sometimes we underestimate the impact of whiteness and the impact of white supremacy because we don't see it every day. But all of our institutions have been shaped by whiteness. Our universities are former plantations. And we go to the plantation every day. And we don't name it, but that's what we're doing. So the thing about the emotional justice framework, it is somatic. It talks about what lives in our body and what's not named, and the emotionality lives in our body. So when I think about the fact that we are performing and functioning in these white institutions, but not naming it, I'm thinking that because we didn't name it, it's not impacting how we relate to each other, how we relate to our women, how we relate to our men, how we relate to our children. So presently in our region, there's this global conflict going on, and the Caribbean is again that playing field where people come out to do their dirty. And because we're not named white supremacy and because we're not named violence, feel as though we're missing the text, the whole text. When you speak about the ways in which whiteness and white supremacy has informed how we move as Caribbean people, I think it's a lot of invisibility. Invisible in terms of we're not naming it, but it lives in our body and it lives in our institution.
100%, 100%. And I'm talking to you from Accra, the capital city of Ghana, and it's true here as well, that because um, repair and healing is very much framed as a black and white scenario, black and white in all the ways, like black and white, literally black and white people, that it's black and white in terms of its simplicity, that there is an absence of complexity because of how it's named and shaped. When I talk about racial healing here in Ghana, people say, everybody's black, the president's black, the janitor is black, the bank manager, what are you talking about? But the legacy of colonialism is so deep in our economy. If I leave by where I am now and I go to a very nice fancy hotel and I ask for mango juice, I'm not having mango juice that's pureed from mangoes that are planted here in Ghana by farmers. I'm not drinking Ghana mango juice. It's imported from somewhere. If I have a very nice salad, my tomatoes are not the tomatoes that the Ghanaian farmers planted, even though we grow them. And our economy would require the farmers to have their tomatoes be part of a national economy. The tomatoes might be Italian. And this idea that the mere fact that it is outside of you makes it better is how the legacy of colonialism shows up here in Ghana. So everybody may be black, but you're sitting in a restaurant and you think because those tomatoes are Italian and they're not Ghanaian, that's how we know this is fine dining. That's how we know this is a particular quality. And so same thing with our cocoa, that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire 70-80% of the entire world's cocoa comes from two countries in West Africa, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And yet when people talk about the chocolate capitals of the world, it's Switzerland and it's Belgium. Mm-hmm. How is that possible? And it's possible because we are not framing our healing and the legacies of colonialism within our local economies. And yes, part of the cancer of supremacy is imposing lived experiences. And you saw it partly at the anti-racism summit, that I think it was Loveland who talked about you can be the difference between being a minority and being minoritized.
Yes.
I think Blackness is always being minoritized, and it's always a major issue every single time, everywhere and anywhere in the world. And so to your point, I call it the hyper visible invisible. That the fact that you can't see it, it is hugely present in these spaces that we're moving through, even though it's not named. And so part of the work of emotional justice really is naming. Name the thing so that we can describe the thing, so we can articulate why the thing is problematic in order to identify a way to resolve the thing or to create a resource or a support that can dismantle the thing. But the naming piece around emotionality as structural rather than individual, so critical. So critical.
And it's the thing that needs to happen.
It
and
really
so when you
does.
talk about those 4 languages of emotional justice, the defining, this is what it is, the unlearning, the unlearning,
unlearning,
the reclaiming, and then the reimagining. And so sometimes like you jump to reimagining. We're like, let's change this, let's make it lovely. And even in our space in the Caribbean, I think this is what makes you the global Black chick as well, because you're able to navigate all of those spaces, and we all, I feel, jumping to reimagination
Right. Right.
in
And
a
who are we
distinct
jumping
way.
for?
Not us. We're
Because what first
performing.
we really are, but it's also that is part of what I call this emotional inheritance of the language of whiteness. That the emotional inheritance, you couldn't stay in the horror and the pain that you felt because that might damage you, your physical body. It might affect your family. It might lose you your position. It might lose you. There was a real cost as well as a toll to not jumping from the horror that's perpetuated to just, it's just another day. Somebody gets lynched, let's just get on with work. And so the legacy of that is that in our healing, we treat our healing the way harm was treated, but we don't recognize it as harm because we now called it healing. And yet the
Yes.
process is so critical because our emotionality has been bastardized. That is why in emotional justice, we say the love language of whiteness is intimate reckoning. And the love language of Black people is intimate revolution. Intimate reckoning, because intimacy is the institution in which whiteness flourishes for white folks. Intimacy is the institution where whiteness and its horror is nurtured, shaped, not just taught, not just enforced, but it is caressed, it is affirmed, it is encouraged. Intimacy not as an experience between individuals, but actually the institution that holds up the horror in a particular way. And particularly when we talk and we do work with white women, is that you are the warriors, as in WORRIERS, the warriors of white masculinity. Your job is to, part of your work and your emotional labor is to sustain a white masculinity of this idea of civilizer, conqueror, and ruler. And so those things are not titles for white men. That's their essence. It's their identity. So it's the idea of if you are not the leader, then who are you? It goes to your essence as a man. And so the institution of intimacy feeds a masculinity that is, in terms of white masculinity, is deeply toxic. But when you come to Black folk, I say you don't use the same language because you're not talking about the same terms. So we never say toxic masculinity. We say Black masculinity is traumatized. It's a very different thing.
Let's stop right there. Stop right there. Stop right there. I'm loving that you're going there because you talk very clearly about we all have work to do
Yes,
when we
very
talk
much so.
about emotional justice, and it's not the same work. Like Black women and Black men have work to do. That's
Right.
very distinct. So I want us to talk about traumatized masculinity for Black men and what that means. I don't like the term toxic masculinity for many reasons, especially particularly when we talk about our Black men. I feel because we label them as toxic and we don't speak about the inheritance that's in their skin, in their bones that they're working out as well. And so that touches on it really clearly. So I want to ask you to tell us more about how you think about Black masculinity and being traumatized. What is the work?
Black men's masculinity is traumatized. What do I mean by that? I mean that in order to survive, in your bones, you understood that white masculinity was about dominion. And the bodies over whom they had to have dominion were yours. And so, on the one hand, masculinity is about this notion of strength and upholding a certain kind of power. But on the other hand, yours is the body over whom dominion is required in order for white masculinity to feel like men. So it creates what I call turmoil and tenderness. It is absolute turmoil. It's the trauma of harm being done at any given time in order for some white man to feel like a white man. It is the adultification of Black boys and the infantilization of white men. You infantilize white men so that they can evade the accountability for the harm that they perpetrate. And you adultify Black boys to justify the kind of harm that white masculinity perpetrates on them. So that's the black and white piece. What does that mean in our communities? It means that the emotional inheritance for Black men in this contemporary landscape comes from these systems of colonialism and apartheid and enslavement. So the trauma is an entire emotional illiteracy. Your anger, your vulnerability, your tenderness, your emotions are not legible in your body because the survival mechanisms that were required for you to, not just you, but all the men that came before you to survive, required that your anger could not be expressed. It's a universal human emotion, but it's racialized and it's gendered, in this case, in terms of masculinity. So you swallow that anger and it has to shape shift in your body all the time in order for you to manufacture contentment. Now, if we sit and really sit with that you have to swallow it, that it has to go down your throat into your body. If we think about how that actually metastasizes, and you did that day in, day out, and then it was passed generation to generation. What does anger even look like? Was it even anger or was it actually pain? That it really helps shape an emotional illiteracy. And then part of the healing is you have to now become emotionally literate. And because we are Black, with emotional justice, we say that work is going to be done in community. Because when you don't do that work in community, when it comes to Black folks, the institution of intimacy is where Black masculinity seeks a certain kind of safety. The challenge with that safety is that too often the trauma is then poured onto the bodies of Black women, that they find their way on the backs of Black women. And that cannot create a healing community. What it does is it creates harm. It creates a harm and it sustains a harm that is now masquerading as healing. And what does that look like? You hear Black women talk about the amount that they're willing to take. I can take it. I'm ride or die. Ride or what? I'm the sacrifice that I've been willing to make in order to sustain this relationship. The language of love is very much about the endurance of harm. And so our institution of intimacy has been about managing harm in order for us to all stay alive. But the truth is, survival may have been mission and mantra. The truth is, everybody didn't survive. They just didn't survive. And those who survived, there's both cost and toll and consequence. So now our work, and specifically with Black men, it's about developing an emotional literacy. It's identifying the emotional inheritance. You'll have men who say, I wasn't raised by men, I was raised with women. That doesn't mean you don't have an emotional inheritance of Black masculinity, because you still came to this earth through more than one body. It still took two people. And whatever you think you don't know, you're shaped by all these lived experiences that came before you, generations deep. And so part of the work of emotional justice is saying this has to be a generation where our emotionality becomes a critical part of what we define as healing. And for that, it is process. And the reason why I always say our work is ours to do and it's no one else's. Black masculinity and the healing from a traumatized masculinity is the emotional work of Black men. It is no one else's. What we do, though, in communities, we build resources. Including Black women. That's really critical. Black women cannot heal the traumatized masculinity of Black men. But it's also not their work, because Black women have our work to do, and our work is not the same. Our work is about an emotional relationship to labor that taught us our soul value is in labor. Your soul value is the work that you did outside of yourself for communities other than yourself. And what it taught us that if your only value is labor, and I'm not talking about a work ethic, the way that you just do a piece of work. I'm talking about backbreaking, soul aching, grind, exhaustion. That level of labor is upheld and revered and applauded. You're dying, it's killing you, yet still.
But you're a strong Black woman.
There's the expectation that you just keep going. And that's our inheritance. That's our emotional inheritance. And we have got to navigate and reckon with that. But for Black masculinity, emotional literacy is the key. And in order to develop an emotional literacy, it requires a reckoning with that emotional inheritance. Because ultimately what they're building is emotional infrastructure. And it's not that, because I don't know, people talk about, I don't want unhealed people around me. I'm like, this is hundreds of years of systems of harm. We're going to be healing for generations, but we can run our leg of the healing race. We can do our emotional work. And that means what we're doing is we're offering an intervention to that emotional inheritance. It's not being passed down uninterrupted and unexamined. There's actually a space where we're engaging and we're exploring and we're naming and we're thinking and we're being in conversation with each other. And that's really the work of emotional justice, to create resource to support that. So we have a project called Moving Masculinity that's specifically about it. It's a resource. We call it the Digital Village. And Black men go online and you can be in community, loss, regret, grief, shame, vulnerability. And we have a room about damage, the way you've been harmed, how that harm has shaped you, the kind of harm you may have caused others, and what it means to name that, to take accountability for that, and to really take these spaces that are online and saying, how do we modernize and digitize ancestral tradition, create an intimacy that is critical to safety, but then still say the invitation is yours. It's your work to do. And Black women are not at the table when you're doing it. Critical. So
I
critical.
love that notion of running our emotional leg. I think about Resler's work as well. And
Yes.
when he speaks about the fact that we're carrying 500 years of racial charge, and we think that we can begin to solve it because we are awake, there's so much of this that we're not going to be able to even accomplish in our generation. But are you willing to run the leg? And
Absolutely.
you said clearly that the work is process.
It really
I hear a
is.
lot of men talk about I was raised by women, but they don't speak about the absence that raised them. Instead, they only speak about the presence that raised them.
Absolutely. And because the that's part of the emotional illiteracy. We
Yeah.
we don't think about measuring absence and the weight of absence in shaping who you became and why that becoming continued in the way that it did. But also that we have the 500 years of the horrors of enslavement, if you're talking about America, but also the continent, the Caribbean, Brazil,
Mhm.
Europe. But there's also who you were before these horrors and these systems of horror. So we also always had a masculinity of both development that then became navigating dominion. So there's still the emotional inheritance isn't broken, but it is absolutely suppressed. And the only way you transform it is you've got to excavate it. You know what I mean? And so that emotional leg of your particular race is as much work as you're willing to do. But it's also understanding that it's no one else's work to do. Nobody else can run your emotional leg for you. And the belief or the expectation or the requirement that somebody else will is just sustaining harm and calling it the practice of healing. And we see
Yes.
that, we see that, right? We see that.
Yeah.
What would it
Yeah.
mean to see that in the Caribbean? What would it mean to see that in the UK? What would it mean to see that in Accra? So I'm in Ghana. Well, they'll say, well, we don't have those legacies of enslavement and colonialism. I said, literally, Ghana was the place where the enslaved then ended up being called Brazilian or African American or European, or
Mhm.
there's a literal history of those who stayed, as well as those who were stolen. There's also the colonization, and there's also our own ancestral histories and the way they both show up and shape in beautiful ways and traumatize and damage in other ways. All of that is part of our emotional inheritance. And part of global Blackness is recognizing that there is a specificity and a particularity to each of our Blacknesses. And we could honor them, we
Yes.
can honor each of them without creating what I call this imposed Black supremacy, which doesn't work for us either. So I don't do purity in Blackness. I don't do monolith Blackness. None of it is real.
Yes.
And it's not just not real, fruitless, boring, very tired arguments that nobody ever
It doesn't
wins.
serve us. Nobody wins.
And it's not true. At this point, it's not true. Colonization happened, apartheid happened, enslavement happened. And so Blackness has been expanded. We now have to live with and deal with what it's become. And there is a beauty in what it became, as well as the loss and the grief that came with that. But what you can't do is magic it away or decide that you're going to tell somebody who they are, which all Black people seem to feel the need to tell another Black person who they are and who they're not. What is that about? What is that? What is that about? It don't work for nobody. It doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't work for anyone.
So the emotional labor of resistance is very specific. It's specific across gender. It's also specific across nationality, and it's not. So this idea of global Blackness, I love it because there's a thing that we know, like when we walk into a room, we know it. I used to joke that I was Trinidadian until I moved to New York and then I became West Indian. All of a sudden.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That's
and
so
then
true.
I know I feel in Ghana. I feel Ghana has this particular connection with the Caribbean as well. There's a way in which, it helps that you can see the George Patmore Library. The sign on the side of the road. I'm like, oh,
That's true.
I feel the Caribbeanness in that experience. So there's so many things that we need to name and things we need to unlearn, things we need to call by their name, lies.
Yes.
Yeah, not even
100%.
mixed lies, blatant lies. And
100%.
there is an emotional labor around resistance. And we're going to put all the resources on so people can learn more about the work you're doing around masculinity that you're inviting people to do as they run their emotional leg. I want to speak a little bit about the work of Black women. What is in our quadrant? And I feel like the first step is differentiating our work from other people's work.
Yeah.
Because so much of how we've been raised, what's in our bones, is to take care of others.
Absolutely.
I'm often blown away by how I have to reckon in my body with silence. Like, it's okay to speak. That it seems like my natural condition in certain places to be silent. And that has a lot to do with the emotional inheritance that I have as a Black woman, but also my own family. So many ingredients that have up the somatic experience that I am having in the world. And it's not even the same for all Black women or all Caribbean women. So as we start thinking about our life as Black women, if you can talk a little bit about how do we start to get clarity on our work?
Yeah. So in emotional justice, it's two things. One is about unlearning emotional patriarchy and saying goodbye to the emotional mammy. Unlearning emotional patriarchy is a system that centers the feelings of men, centrally white men and white people, and all men, no matter what the toll or the consequence and the cost is to your Black woman's body, your Black woman's health and your Black woman's thriving. Saying goodbye to the emotional mammy is taken from, of course, the mammy is the language of the South in America. And the mammy, in terms of American history, was traditionally seen as this dark-skinned, large woman, Black woman, who took care of the Black family. People think of the Gone with the Wind and Hattie McDaniels and the role that she played in that film when they visualize the Black mammy. And the point of that character is that it's not just that she took care of white families and white children, that she took utter pleasure in doing that nothing gave her more pleasure than taking care of white people. She had no life and no family and no community that anybody knew anything about. She was this sole person who took care of this entire family and was always available day, night, didn't matter what was happening, to solve everything, to make sure everything was okay. And her entire existence was about being in service to this white family. The emotional mammy is about a Black woman, any hue, any shape, any size, and from anywhere in the world, who's expected to take care of the feelings of the society, the community, and the family in which she was raised, in which she is shaped, in which she's schooled, and in which she's grown, no matter what the cost is and the toll is and the consequence is to her, her body, her thriving, and her future. And so intimate revolution is about, one, identifying our relationship as Black women to labor, and a labor that taught us our only value was in the labor that we performed to people outside of ourselves. And how, because it became deeper than simply work, it became about value. So the value that you held for yourself was connected in the labor that you provided for other people, and that you found value in that, which means that you became valuable because of the work that you did. But it also meant that you were nurtured to consider centering yourself, your needs, your health as selfish. It was a judgment. It was a negation. And somehow you were less of a Black woman if you did that. If you asked for help and sought help, somehow you were less of a Black woman. So it's deeper than the strong Black woman trope. It's this entire emotional inheritance that made you both an island and an oasis for everybody except for you. And then the challenge for us as Black women is that we then developed emotional connections and emotional commitments to struggle. And that struggle was the way that we valued ourselves in the world. And we had a deep, abiding commitment to struggle. And if the shit wasn't hard, somehow we hadn't earned it, we didn't have the right to have it, and it wasn't even valuable. So the expectation that it would always be hard, that struggle was the way that you measured that you really were an activist, you really were in a decolonial movement, you really were in a liberation movement, you were really in a family. You were really willing to be part of any community, is your willingness to struggle, to take something on and to take it on and to take it on, and to do so without help. That is much more than activity. It became relationship. And the thing for us about Black women is breakups are hard. Breakups are just hard. And a breakup with a relationship to struggle that exists over centuries, 500 years, 400 years, is a specific type of process. That is why the love language for Black women is intimate revolution, as well as revolutionary Black grace. It is revolutionary Black grace because it's inviting Black women to, one, recognize there is a turmoil and a tenderness inside of us that feels like it's at war. And the reason it feels like it's at war is because we are actually challenging an emotional inheritance that made us value and celebrate a level of struggle that actually took people out. And maybe they didn't die physically, but they were dead emotionally. They were dealing with levels of sickness or addiction or substance issues or whatever the thing was, the coping mechanisms that we developed because there was no reckoning with the emotional inheritance that we were given. The reason why the love language also of Black men, but for Black women, is revolutionary Black grace, is that grace is something that is too rarely afforded Black women. We don't afford it to each other. We are often each other's harshest critics. The way that we uphold a relationship to struggle is very often how we treat each other, as well as being each other's champions, as well as cheerleading for each other in the way that nobody else does. We literally are both of those things. But our emotional work is to break up with struggle, to have our 12-step program about this addiction to a level of struggle where we find value, and to transform a relationship to labor where you found your soul value in labor that you perform for people outside of yourself, and then saying goodbye to the emotional nanny. So we created a very special project centering Black women. It's called Wellness in the Face of Warfare. And it's called Wellness in the Face of Warfare because for Black women, the world is at war with your thriving. When you are really well and healthy and taken care of, that means that you're setting up boundaries and borders for the ways that people access you and engage you and for the work that you're doing. You're less available to do A, B, C, D, all of these things that have led people to both celebrate you, but to also really take you for granted. Ending those will feel like warfare because you're navigating and you're now creating an intervention in an inheritance where that has been the sole will. passed down generation to generation. How much more can you do for your community, for your family, for your organization, for your nation, for the world, for Black men, for white people? How much more can you do? And however much more you've done, it's never enough. And so what happens for us is that the universality of emotions, the shape shifting that happens, there's so little grace given to Black women. Part of our emotional inheritance is the absence of grace and the absence of care, a care that centers how we move. And we have this kind of dual inheritance because we are caretakers who do not necessarily take care of our own emotional selves. We are
Yes.
expert caretakers. We can heal a million things, but won't ask help for when we are in the type of trouble that could take us out. So many of us have those stories, or know women in our family and in our community where those are our stories. And part of what emotional justice and why it's called wellness in the face of warfare is to say to Black women, me, myself, and I is the first institution that requires wellness. And there's never a fear with Black women that if you say to them, take care of yourselves, that will ever become a singular project, because it is wired in our DNA to take care of community. It is wired in our DNA. So that element of what we call institutionalizing wellness, first for you, individually, interpersonally, and institutionally, that is that specific. Breaking up with a struggle that is debilitating and exhausting, and recognizing, just like any breakup, it's hard. You have breakup sex, you'll go and drink, you'll go and eat ice cream, you'll return to it, you'll do all the things, and then you'll break up again. And it will take some time because it's a long history that you're navigating. But our work is
Yeah.
hours, and it's very particular, but it's done in deep, deep tenderness and deep compassion and time.
I had a question here about when emotional justice as a framework has shifted something in the room, and I feel like it just did for me.
When did it shift?
It shifted that idea of Black grace and ways in which we don't give ourselves grace. And the fact that that is something that's in our marrow. So it means that it doesn't matter how much we talk about it, how much we think we know it here. Our default, our muscle memory is around service and a lack of grace for ourselves. And that work, I think about how many times we have to be committed to giving ourselves grace and not giving
And
up
we
on
really do.
ourselves.
Yeah. And it's grace the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time. Give that sister grace, give yourself grace. Because often what happens is Black women are spoken about in binary terms, and the
Yeah.
complexity of our emotional inheritance is neither understood, it's not named, it's not acknowledged, and it's not respected. Because Black women's service changes worlds, no one is interested in losing that. And
Yeah.
the lengths they will go to sustain that will harm us. So the people invested in this is us. That's what's going to make the breakup harder, because you don't necessarily have an army of people cheering for you to do the breakup, because it transforms a home. It transforms an organization. You won't be the first one to do A, B, C, D. It requires that the work be spread out in a way that it was never spread out before. All of these things shift. And Malcolm X says, when you educate a woman, you educate a nation. But when a woman is healed, when a Black woman is healed, you have transformed a nation. I don't know that we're ready for that transformation, and our readiness requires that we're all doing our emotional work. So when you hear Black men talk about, I was listening to this on a podcast on Native Land podcast that I love with Tiffany Cross, Angela Rye, Andrew Gillum, and a new contributor called Bakari Sellers. And Bakari was speaking about this idea of masculinity and can men be heard when there's all this celebration of Black girl magic? And when I heard him say
Mm.
that, I said, because the nature of Black women's emotional inheritance has been to make space for everybody. So the
Yes.
idea that their uplift is a loss for Black men and Black masculinity is what happens when Black
Yes.
masculinity isn't doing its emotional work. Because if we are both doing our emotional work, these transitions will naturally start to happen. They will naturally start to happen. Not that there won't be tension, not that there won't be conflict. Of course there will be. You're interrupting hundreds of years of inheritance, but the transition changes how we move. So my uplift can never be a negation of what you're going through. And the mere fact that we think about it in those terms is reflective of our current emotional inheritance. And that is Black women's service must always center everybody other than themselves. And people talk about the noise of Black women being celebrated. And I'm like, it's been 2 minutes. It's been 2 minutes. What are we talking about?
What are we talking about?
It's been 2 minutes. But it's a reminder, one of the emotional, the racialized emotional labor that is part of Black women's inheritance. But it's also a racialized emotional labor the world relies on. And so when we choose to have a breakup, the world is going to push back. And that's why our emotional work requires a grace and a tenderness, because the pushback is going to feel like, Kilimanjaro. For real, for real.
And I think parts of us, it's going to push back as well, because
Absolutely.
this
Absolutely.
is why the grace is such a powerful moment for me. Because what I'm struggling against is not what I've earned in this lifetime, but what I've earned through generations.
Absolutely.
So I am
Absolutely.
going to
Because
push
what do
back.
we mean when we say we're our, exactly. Because otherwise, what do we mean when we say we're our ancestors' wildest dreams?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was their only dream that you continue to struggle? Was that their only dream? So when we talk about we're building a world for the future, at what point are Black women included in the future of the world that we're building?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? At what
Mm-hmm.
point do you say, okay, well, I must be part of this world that's being built. So the grace must include and extend to me. And your point about Black women will be the ones, we will be the ones who will tell each other, who will police each other's breakup. We will be the ones who will be interventionists to stop the breakup because of what we've all been nurtured in. So the struggle is multi-generational, it's intergenerational, but it must always happen. It is our emotional work. Sisterhood is a superpower. It's been a superpower in sustaining an emotional inheritance that is killing us. It cannot continue.
Yeah. Thank you for that. In closing, I want us to reflect on what becomes possible when our feelings are no longer disavowed but centered.
Woo! Come
Comes
on.
possible.
World
Yeah.
building. And I'm talking about building worlds that you are part of. So often, the language of liberation and freedom is about we're not building this for ourselves, we're doing this for our children and our children's children and our children's children. But when their ancestors said that, they were actually talking about us. We were literally the ones that they were talking about. So then, when our feelings are first being identified, it means that I can't call you out of your name because I can name what I'm actually feeling and maybe it has nothing to do with you. And so what it enables is the possibility of a peace beyond a moment and a peace that is both beauty and balm and blessing. That it enables an end to a kind of striving that is such a fundamental element of the Black experience. And a building, not in terms of the way capitalism describes it, the acquisition of stuff. I mean, the building of our humanity, a reassigning of a full humanity to Black folks, to Black women and Black men. And for me, what that will ultimately do, it will change the way we love each other. And when we change the way we love each other, there is not a single thing we will not be able to do if we so choose.
Thank
That is
you.
emotional justice. That is emotional
That
justice.
is emotional justice. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for your heart and the work of a griot.
Thank you. Thank you for calling me a griot. I'm claiming that. I like that.
Please claim it. You know, we started this conversation with that moment that you had with your mother.
Mm,
You touched on your moments with Winnie Mandela. I'm thinking about my moments with mothers.
mm,
I'm also sitting with we are ancestors' wildest dreams. It is now, right?
it's
So
now.
what are we doing now?
Right.
Yeah. What are
Right.
we doing now? I want to invite you to offer us as a close how you have walked through this world as your mother's dream,
Mm.
your grandmother's dream, and like what's the path that you see yourself in now?
What a beautiful closing question. I am, and my mother is Ashanti, and the Ashanti are a matrilineal warrior tribe here in Ghana. And because they're a warrior tribe, I've always, now because of the work that I do, I think, yes, they're a warrior tribe, but what is their emotional inheritance? And so what I claim and what I believe is the work that I'm doing is reflective of the emotional inheritance of the tribe that I'm from. And so when I think about modernizing and digitizing ancestral traditions, I believe this is my ancestral inheritance that's being manifest in this particular work. And so, in that sense, I carry my mother's broken silence and the silences that she kept, because there are silences that she kept that I don't know, but I know that I carry those. I carry my grandmother's broken silence. And I know that the Ashanti are a tribe where the women name the kings. And I've always understood that as our way of saying to Black women and Black men, we are community. The only way we get through this and do this is together. You don't get any position outside of me. I shape you and you shape me. So those kind of more traditional notions of what we define as patriarchy, there have always been spaces and tribes, but that hasn't necessarily been true, which is not to in any way negate some of the deeply, deeply patriarchal elements of Ghanaian tribes. Lord knows they're there.
Yep.
But so for my mother, that's what I believe. I believe the emotional inheritance of our tribe is what I carry in doing this work. And that because I do work around masculinity as well, and people say to me all the time, well, what right do you have to do the work? I just say I stand on my ancestral tradition. We have always shaped each other, and it gives me a peace. It gives me blessing. It gives me a power that I thoroughly enjoy. And it has taught me grace in a way that I don't know that anything else had. And because of what it's taught me there is a fragility even within warrior tribes. And to honor that and to name that, recognize that I have it. And all of that then shows up and shapes the work, that I do. That ultimately the work is deeply, deeply, deeply spiritual. And for me, when I fully understood that and gave it that spiritual power, it became transformative. And so I honor my mother's broken silence, but I also really honor the silences that I know she never broke and why she didn't break them. Whatever the reason, I know that I carry the inheritance, as we all do as Black women, as we all do.
Safe. Thank you.
My pleasure. This was so beautiful. Okay, Saltwater Reasonings.
You are lovely. You are lovely. You're my blessing. I'm so glad we're on the same timeline.
Me
Thank you.
too.
You have been listening to Saltwater Reasonings, where we sit with the work of care, struggle, and collective knowing. My deep thanks to Esther Armah for this uncompromising and necessary reasoning. Her articulation of emotional justice reminds us that freedom without feeling is incomplete, and that liberation requires us to reckon with how we relate, repair, and remain accountable to one another. We have explored why feelings are political, why emotional labor has been unevenly borne by Black women, and why healing demands more than endurance or silence. This episode calls us to reimagine justice as relational work, sustained by grief, love, and collective responsibilities. To learn more about Esther's work and to explore related resources, visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me for the next tag in this series as we continue to reason across history, bodies, and futures in search of repair.